The infant stopped breathing for 3 full seconds sometime before dawn on the 23rd of October, 1883, in a sod-roofed cabin 11 miles west of Fort Collins, Colorado. And in that terrible pause, Nora Voss pressed her ear to the small chest and heard nothing but the wind eating at the eaves and the fire she had kept burning since midnight crackling in the iron stove. Then the baby drew a ragged, crowing breath, and she let out her own. And across the room, Brett Caldwell set down the kettle he had been holding over the steam pot and put both his hands flat on the table and did not move for a long moment, the way a man does when the ground has shifted under him and he is making certain it is settled. That was October. To understand what it meant, you have to go back to April, to a platform at the Fort Collins depot, to a woman stepping off a train with a canvas bag and a letter she had read so many times the creases were soft as cloth. The advertisement had appeared in a Cincinnati matrimonial circular in the first week of February 1883, tucked among 7 other notices from men in Kansas and Nebraska and the Wyoming territories who were looking for wives in the way a man looks for a good plow horse, with careful attention to practical qualities. Most of those notices were blunt to the point of gracelessness. Brett Caldwell's was not blunt. It was, as Nora would later tell Ida, carefully incomplete. He had written that he was a widower of 36, in sound health, ranching 320 acres in Larimer County, Colorado, with good water rights and a note to the feed supplier that he expected to clear by autumn. He had described the house as solid, the winters as demanding, and the household as lively. That word, lively, was the one she returned to in the weeks between writing her reply and packing her bag. She had imagined something modest and domestic by it. A cat, perhaps. A dog that barked at the wrong hours. She had not imagined 6 children. Nora was 28 years old when she answered that notice. She had been educated at a girls' academy in Cincinnati before her father's importing firm went under in the panic of 1873. And she had spent the decade since keeping books for a dry goods merchant on 4th Street, who paid her enough to rent a room and not quite enough to stop thinking about what else a life might contain. She was not romantic about the West. She had read enough to know what sod houses were and what 30 below felt like on paper. She was practical in the way that people become practical when they have had their illusions cleared away young, and she was tired of a life whose dimensions she could measure exactly, because she had measured them every day for 10 years. She wrote Brett a letter that was honest to a fault, which she would later recognize as both her strongest quality and the one that most unsettled him. She told him she had been educated, that she was not fragile, that she had no family left in Cincinnati worth mentioning, and that she was not afraid of work, though she admitted she had done more of it with a ledger than with her hands. She asked him 3 direct questions about the household and the range of duties she would be expected to perform. He answered 2 of them. The train from Denver pulled into Fort Collins on the 3rd of April, with a sound like a long exhalation, and Nora stepped down onto the platform in a gray wool traveling dress that had been sensible in Ohio and felt entirely inadequate against a Colorado spring wind that smelled of snowmelt and cattle. She had her canvas bag in one hand and was scanning the platform for a man of 36 in sound health, when she found, instead, 6 children standing in a loose formation beside a wagon, the tallest watching her with an expression that suggested he had made a decision about her before she cleared the bottom step. Behind them, a man stood with his hat in his hands. He was tall and raw-boned, with a face that had spent years outdoors and wore the evidence plainly, creased at the corners, dark from the sun, the jaw set in a way that might have been stubborn or might have been shy. He looked at her and then at his hat, and then at the platform boards, and in that small sequence Nora understood several things at once. the chief of which was that the word lively had been doing a great deal of work in that advertisement. She counted. She counted again, because the smallest one, a boy of perhaps 10 months, was seated in the wagon bed, wrapped in a quilt, and not standing with the others. And she wanted to be certain she had the number right. She set her bag down on the platform and looked at Brett Caldwell. "Your advertisement mentioned a lively household," she said. "Yes," he said. "It did not mention 6 children." He was quiet for a moment. The wind moved across the platform. The 14-year-old, whose name was Clem and whose expression had not changed since she descended the steps, folded his arms. "No," Brett said. "It did not. Did you think I would not notice them when I arrived? Or did you think I would not come if you said so?" He looked at her then, directly, and there was something in the look that was neither apology nor defiance, but a kind of plain admission. "Second one," he said. She picked up her bag. She looked at the 6 of them, the tall, suspicious boy, a girl of 11 with watchful dark eyes who was holding the hand of a smaller girl, 2 boys in the middle range of childhood, standing close enough together to suggest they came as a pair, and the infant in the wagon who had begun pulling at the edge of his quilt with single-minded concentration. "I see," Nora said. She walked to the wagon and put her bag in the bed beside the infant, who looked up at her and pulled the quilt a little harder. She climbed to the seat and waited. After a moment, Brett Caldwell put his hat back on and came around to the other side. They drove the 11 miles to the ranch without a great deal of conversation, which suited both of them better than either knew at the time. The house was, in fact, solid. It was also smaller than she had calculated from his description, a 2-room log structure with a lean-to kitchen added on the south side. The floor in the main room hard-packed earth covered with 2 braided rugs that had seen better years, a plank table long enough to seat 8 if they pressed close, and a single window facing east that let in the morning light and not much else. There was a sod-roofed barn that smelled of horses and hay and was in better repair than the house. The well was close, which Nora noted as a practical mercy. The mountains to the west were, she would admit to no one for several weeks, more than she had prepared herself for. The 11-year-old, whose name was Ida, showed her the house with a seriousness that suggested she had been doing it since she was much younger. She named things as they moved through the rooms: the water barrel that needed filling every other morning, the corner where the youngest 2 slept, the shelf of supplies and what was on it, which was not much, and the peg by the door where Brett's coat hung, and where Nora was welcome to hang her own. "You can have the corner behind the curtain," Ida said, indicating a flour sack curtain strung on a wire that divided a sleeping space from the rest of the main room. It was about 4 feet wide. "Thank you," Nora said. "Clem doesn't think you'll stay," Ida said, not unkindly, with the calm neutrality of someone reporting weather. "What do you think?" Nora asked. Ida considered this with the gravity of a much older person. "I think you counted us at the depot and you still got in the wagon," she said. "That's something." That was the first night. There were many nights after it, and most of them were better, and some of them were considerably worse. But that one established the terms of what Nora's life on the Caldwell place would be, which was to say, a life in which very few things were as advertised, and most of them were more. She had been practical in her letter to him, and she had been right to be, because the work was substantial. The 320 acres ran mostly to grazing land with a creek that dried to a trickle by July, and Brett ran cattle on it, not many, but enough that the seasonal demands were steady and the margin for error was not wide. The debt to the feed supplier stood at $140, which Brett mentioned to her in the first week the way a man mentions a crack in a wall, directly and without embellishment, so she would know it was there. He was not a man who softened things. He spoke in sentences that contained exactly the information they needed, and nothing else. And at first she found this unsettling. And then, over weeks, she found it clarifying, because she knew when he was finished speaking that she had the true version of what he thought. She learned the house the way she had learned the dry goods ledger, methodically and without complaint. The cooking was harder than she had expected, not because she was incapable, but because cooking on a wood stove for 8 people at altitude in a lean-to kitchen where the wind came through a gap in the south wall required a kind of physical confidence she had to build from nothing. The first supper she made was a bean and salt pork affair that Clem ate with the expression of someone performing a civic duty. Thomas, who was 8 and had not yet learned the art of concealment, told her it tasted like river mud. Ruth, who was 6, said she liked it, which Nora understood was kindness rather than honesty, and appreciated it for what it was. Brett ate 3 helpings and said nothing, which she could not interpret, and spent 2 days trying. She asked Ida to teach her the stove, and Ida did, seriously and without condescension. And within a fortnight the suppers were edible, and within 6 weeks they were good. The children were her first difficulty and her first education. Clem treated her with a careful courtesy that was colder than open hostility, because it allowed no purchase, nothing to argue with, nothing to soften. He did his share of the work, more than his share, and he was scrupulously polite, and he never once suggested by word or expression that she belonged there. Thomas and Ruth accepted her with the adaptability of children who had already absorbed one large loss and were accustomed to adjustment. Little May, who was 4, followed Nora at a distance for the first 2 weeks like a small, uncertain animal, and then one morning climbed into her lap at the table without asking and went to sleep. And that was that. And then there was Arlo. Arlo was 10 months old when she arrived, and he had his father's dark eyes and his father's habit of watching everything from a position of apparent stillness before deciding whether to respond. He had been passed between his older siblings since his mother's death the previous autumn, and he had adapted to this with a practicality that Nora found in a baby, both touching and a little heartbreaking. He went where he was put. He did not fuss. He watched everything. When Nora first picked him up on the morning of her second day, he regarded her face for a long interval with his father's direct gaze, and then put his fist in her hair, and she decided that constituted an acceptance. If you are the kind of person who has ever watched a guarded thing slowly decide it is safe, you know what the next several months looked like. Brett Caldwell was not a cold man. He was a quiet man, which is a different thing entirely. And he was a man who had learned to say what mattered through the doing of it rather than the stating of it. So she had to learn to read him in that language, and it took time. She noticed in the 3rd week of April that the gap in the south kitchen wall had been patched with clay and straw while she slept. She did not comment on this because she understood that he would not have wanted her to. But she noted it. She noticed in the 1st week of May that the water barrel was full each morning before she rose, which meant he was drawing it in the dark before his own day began. She noticed that when she struggled with the heavy cast-iron Dutch oven, he moved it without being asked and without ceremony, and then went back to what he was doing as though nothing had happened. She was learning, in other words, how a man could speak at length without opening his mouth. He was learning things too, though he showed this even less readily. She had brought 12 books in that canvas bag, which surprised him, and she set them on a plank above the window, and he looked at that plank for a week before saying anything about it. "You read all of those?" he said one evening with a tone that suggested he was unsure whether this was impressive or suspicious. "Several times," she said. "I can lend them." He picked one up, turned it over, read the title, set it back. "Maybe," he said. 2 weeks later, she noticed a different one missing and did not remark on that either. It was Ida who first asked about Cincinnati. They were shelling beans together at the table on a warm June evening, the younger children outside, Clem somewhere in the barn, and Ida asked in her direct way what Nora's family had been. "My father had an importing business," Nora said. "Fabric and dry goods, mostly from the Eastern trade. It was a good business for a while." "What happened to it?" "The panic of 1873, Nora said. "The firm failed. My father spent the next 2 years trying to recover it, and then he died. And after that, there was nothing to recover." Ida shelled beans in silence for a moment. "Is that why you came?" "Partly," Nora said. It was Brett who got the rest of the answer, and not because he asked for it. He came in one evening in late June to find Nora at the table with her account book, the small one she kept for the household, and she was writing in it with the focus of someone whose precision was trained and not merely habitual. And he stood watching her for a moment before she looked up. "You kept books," he said. "For 10 years, she said. "For the merchant?" "Yes." He sat down across from her, which wasn't something he usually did when she was working at the table. He looked at the account book and then at her. "Why did you leave?" She set her pen down. She told him about the panic, about her father, about the years of keeping careful numbers for another man's business, and knowing the cost of everything, and owning none of it. She told him about the room she rented that was exactly large enough for a bed and a trunk, and 12 books stacked in the corner. She told him that when she had read the advertisement in the circular, the word lively had struck her not as a description of a household, but as a description of something she was fairly sure no longer applied to her own life, and she had wanted to find out whether that could change. He listened to all of this without moving. "I lied to you about the children," he said when she had finished. "I know." "I thought no one would come," he said, "if they knew." "They probably wouldn't have," she said. "Most women would have found someone with a smaller household, or fewer windows." He looked at the account book. "Do you wish you had?" She considered the question as she would consider any question that deserved an honest answer, which was carefully and without giving him something more comfortable than the truth. "No," she said, "not particularly." That answer did not transform anything between them. It did not need to. It was the first brick of something, and they both recognized that, and they both left it where it lay and let the rest of the summer build on top of it. It was in August that she learned about Walt Greer's wager. Ruth told her, with the particular innocence of a 6-year-old who does not know that information can be weighted. She was helping Nora hang the washing, and she said, without preamble, that Mr. Greer from the next property had told somebody's father at the feed store that the city woman at the Caldwell place would be gone by first snowfall, and he would bet a good horse on it. Nora did not comment on this. She pinned a shirt to the line. "Are you going to leave?" Ruth asked. "I haven't decided to leave," Nora said. "Clem thinks Mr. Greer is probably right," Ruth added helpfully. "Clem is entitled to his opinion," Nora said. "Hand me that pillowcase." She thought about it that night, not with anger, but with the particular clarity that arrives when you understand that a situation has been defined for you by people who have not taken the time to know you. She had not come to Larimer County to prove anything to Walt Greer. She had come because she was done measuring the same small room. The wager was irrelevant to her reasons. It was relevant to her stubbornness, which was, as her father had once told her most Voss-like quality. She stayed. September was the month the work became something other than a performance. She had been learning the physical language of the ranch all summer, how to read the cattle for signs of trouble. how to stack hay so the rain ran off rather than in, how to tell from the creek's color whether rain was coming off the high ground. Brett taught her most of this without being asked, in the same way he did everything, by doing it in her presence and waiting to see whether she was watching. She always was. One afternoon in the middle of September, with a fence section down on the north pasture and 3 steers having wandered through it into the neighbor's land, she and Clem spent 4 hours restretching wire and resetting the post without Brett, because Brett had ridden to the feed supplier in Fort Collins to negotiate the debt down from $140 to something they could service before winter. Clem worked beside her with the focused quiet of someone who has accepted a situation without yet accepting the person in it. They did not talk much. They did the work. When they finished, Clem looked at the repaired fence for a moment and said, "You set the post plumb." "I watched how it was done," she said. He nodded once, which was not warmth, but it was not the careful courtesy either. It was something in between. Brett came home that evening with $80 in credit applied against the debt and the supplier's agreement to extend the remainder to spring. He told her this at the table after supper the way he told her most things, directly and without ceremony, and she understood that he was telling her because she had a right to know the numbers she would help manage through the winter. She updated the account book and told him where they stood, and he looked at the figures for a while and then said, "You kept good books." "It's what I know how to do," she said. By October, they had settled into a life that was not what either of them had imagined, and was better than either of them had planned for, though neither would have said so aloud. There was still the formal separation between them that the circumstances required, but it had grown porous. She knew which board in the kitchen floor would not hold a bucket, and which window stuck on a warm day. He knew that she took her tea without sugar and read before the lamp went out and did not want to be spoken to in the first half hour of the morning. These are not the intimacies people write letters about. They are the ones that hold. Arlo had been pulling himself up against the furniture since September, and he had begun to make sounds that approximated words, most of them directed at Nora, who was the person he saw most consistently across any given day. When he reached for her, she picked him up, and when she set him down, he tracked her across the room with his father's eyes. And Brett watched this happen, evening after evening, with an expression that was quiet and legible to anyone paying attention, which Nora by October was. The night of the 22nd of October began like the previous several dozen. The temperature had been dropping hard for a week, and by late afternoon it stood at something Brett described, looking at his breath in the barn, as proper cold. He did not own a thermometer, but the neighbors to the east had one, and the figure that came back on the county's unofficial network of traded information was 31 degrees below zero before midnight. The creek had already skinned over. The horses were breathing steam in the barn, and the water barrel in the kitchen grew a crust of ice along its sides by evening. Arlo had been fussy since supper, which was unlike him. He had taken his food without appetite and had not pulled at things with his usual systematic interest. Nora noticed this and noted it and kept watch. It was Ida who came for her at 11 o'clock, pulling at her sleeve in the dark, telling her that Arlo was making a noise she didn't know. The noise was the croup's characteristic sound, a hard, barking cough, tight and airless, like something trying to get in where there was no room. Nora had heard it once before, a neighbor's child in Cincinnati, and she knew what it was before she reached the corner where he slept. She picked him up and he coughed against her shoulder, and the sound of it brought Brett in from the main room in 4 steps. She told him she needed steam. She needed the kettle and a blanket, and she needed the stove built up, as hot as it would hold. She told him she needed warm oil, whatever they had, and a cloth. She told him she needed Ida to sleep in the barn loft with the older children tonight, so the room would stay warm, without too many bodies and too many doors opening. He did all of this without question or commentary. What followed was the longest night of that year, and possibly of several years before it. The croup in an infant is not a thing that resolves quickly. It requires continuous tending, holding the child upright so the narrowed airway has the best angle, keeping the steam rising so the tissues open as much as they will, watching the color of the lips and the rate of the small chest's movement. Nora and Brett traded the baby between them across those hours as the temperature outside dropped and the stove worked and the kettle refilled. She rubbed warm oil on his narrow chest. She held him against her shoulder through the fits and talked to him in a low, steady voice that was not so much language as sound. The kind of sound that means, you are not alone in this. Brett sat across from her in those intervals when Arlo slept briefly, the two of them on either side of the stove, and he heated the kettle and watched the child and watched her. And he did not say anything, because there was nothing to say, and because the presence of another person who is fully committed to the same work is a form of speech that does not need words. Around 3 in the morning, Arlo's breathing eased from its terrible, straining quality to something slower and less desperate. He slept. Nora sat with him held against her chest, her back against the wall, and she was aware that Brett had not moved from his chair and was watching her with an expression that had moved past the stoic practicality of the working hours into something more unguarded. He did not say anything about it. He got up and put more wood on the stove and refilled the kettle and sat back down. At 4:30, with the cold still pressing at every seam in the cabin walls and Arlo breathing steadily against her collarbone, Nora said, "He's going to be all right." Brett said, "Yes." She looked at him across the room. He looked back. There was the stove between them and the sleeping child, and 11 miles of frozen Colorado prairie, and whatever they were going to be to each other. And none of it needed to be named right then. "Go to bed," she said. "I have him." He stood. He was at the curtain that divided the sleeping corner before he stopped. "Nora," he said. She waited. He turned and looked at her, and he had the expression of a man who has opened a door he didn't know how to find for a long time. "I'm glad you got in the wagon," he said. She nodded once because she understood the weight of it, coming from him, and she did not want to thin it by saying too much. He went to bed. She sat with Arlo until dawn came gray through the east window, and when the baby woke and looked at her with clear eyes and pulled at the buttons on her dress with his usual business-like intention, she let out a breath that had been building since October. When she brought Arlo out to the table in the morning, she found the woodpile at her door had been restocked, split and stacked in the lean-to where she kept it for the kitchen stove. She stood in the doorway looking at it for a long moment. She had not asked him to do it. She had not needed to ask. He had simply gotten up in the gray of the morning before her and done it. And that was the declaration, as plain and unmistakable as anything that had ever been said aloud. She did not tell anyone. She did not need to. There are things you understand with your hands before your head catches up. And there are things that are settled between two people before they have the conversation about it. The split wood was both. Clem was the one who changed in the weeks that followed, and it happened in the way that genuine changes happen in the young, not in a moment but in an accumulation of moments until you look up and realize you are somewhere different than you started. He watched Nora with Arlo through October and November, and he watched his father. And somewhere in there, the careful courtesy shifted to something that allowed for actual exchanges, specific remarks, the occasional dry observation that was so much his father's son that Nora had to look at the table so as not to smile. In November, he came to her with a question about the account book, about the debt calculation and whether they would clear the feed supplier by spring. and they sat at the table together for an hour while she showed him how to read the figures, and when they were done, he said, "I want to learn all of this." "I'll teach you all of it," she said. He nodded. Then he said, "I was wrong about you," in the direct, plain-spoken way that was the household's common language, the way of people who had learned that bluntness used carefully was a form of respect. "You were protecting your family," she said. "That was correct. Your judgment was not." He almost smiled. Almost? Walt Greer had expected to be proved right by first snowfall, which came in early November and found Nora at the kitchen stove and showed no signs of changing that. He had expected her gone before the cold set in hard, and the cold had set in hard, and she was still there. He did not seek her out to revise his opinion. He was not that kind of man. He was the kind of man whose opinions were mostly about proving he had been right, which meant being proved wrong was a quiet and private difficulty. The circuit preacher came through on the 14th of December, a man named Aldous who traveled a wide route through Larimer County and performed whatever services the territory required, which on that afternoon included the marrying of Brett Caldwell and Nora Voss at the plank table in the log house, witnessed by Ida, Thomas, Ruth, May, and Arlo, who sat in Ida's lap and appeared to regard the proceedings with his customary measured interest. Clem stood at Brett's side with a straight back. Walt Greer had ridden over that morning not for the wedding, but on the ordinary business of neighboring, and had encountered a situation that required him to stay for it. He stood by the door through the brief ceremony with his hat in his hands, and when it was done and Nora had become Nora Caldwell in the eyes of Larimer County and the circuit rider's records, Greer crossed the room and looked at her for a moment with the complicated expression of a man making an honest reassessment of where the evidence had led him. He put his hat back on and said nothing. He tipped the brim in her direction once and went out. That was all she needed from him, and she got it. The debt to the feed supplier was paid in full the following spring. The remainder of the $60 Brett had not settled in September cleared in April of 1884. With the proceeds from a good early sale of yearlings, Nora wrote it into the account book in her clear, careful hand, and closed the entry and put the book on the shelf beside the 12 books that had arrived in the canvas bag 13 months before, though there were now 19 books on that shelf because Brett had added 7 of his own selecting over the year, and the plank had been replaced with a proper board, with a carved edge along the front that served no structural purpose, and that Nora ran her finger across every morning on her way to the stove. That was 1884. What followed was a long life in the same house on the same 320 acres, with the same mountains to the west and the same east window that let in the morning light. Clem left for the agricultural college in Fort Collins at 17, and he came back at 20 and stayed, marrying a rancher's daughter from Weld County and adding a house on the south corner of the acreage. Ida taught school for 3 years in the county before marrying and settling 12 miles east, and she and Nora exchanged letters every week for the rest of their lives. Thomas went north to Wyoming and raised horses. Ruth married a physician in Denver and had 4 children of her own. May stayed until she was 19 and then went east, to Cincinnati of all places, which Nora found quietly amusing and never said so where May could hear. Arlo stayed. He grew up on the ranch the way plants grow when they have been in the same soil since before they could choose, with a deep and unconsidered rootedness. He had his father's economy of speech and his mother's habit of keeping accurate numbers, and he took over the daily running of the 320 acres in his mid-20s when Brett's hands had begun to trouble him, and he never sold an acre of it. Brett died in the spring of 1921 at 74 in the same house, having spent 38 years adding things to it without ceremony. The lean-to kitchen had become a proper addition with a plank floor. The sod roof was long gone. The east window had been joined by two others, and the view from any of them on a clear morning was the mountains and the creek, and the pasture where Arlo's cattle moved through the grass. Nora outlived him by 9 years. She did not leave the ranch. She kept the account book. She kept the shelf with the books, which numbered 43 by then, and she ran her finger along the carved edge every morning on her way to the stove until her hands made that difficult. Arlo's children grew up with her at the table, learning their numbers and a fair amount else besides, and they called her Gran, and she taught them what she knew, which was considerable, and she never made it sound like more than ordinary work. She was buried beside Brett on the hillside above the home pasture in the autumn of 1930, on a clear October day with the aspens turned and the mountains showing their first snow. And Arlo and Clem and Ida were there, and a great many of the county besides, which would have embarrassed her and probably amused her in equal measure. The advertisement she had answered in 1883 is still somewhere in the Larimer County Historical Society's collection, in a folder of similar notices, and if you find it, you will see that he did not lie about anything except the thing he left out entirely. 320 acres in Larimer County, good water rights, a lively household. He was right about all of it. If you have ever known someone who arrived in your life by a description that missed everything important about them, and stayed anyway, because what they found was better than what they expected, you may have something to say about that. Leave it in the comments. It is worth saying. And if you would like another story like this one, the kind where two people figure out that the thing they needed most was not quite what they ordered, there are more of them waiting. The shelf with the carved edge was still in that house when Arlo's grandchildren were grown. Nobody could say who had carved it or why he had put the edge there, because Brett Caldwell was not the kind of man who explained himself. But it was there every morning under her hand, and that was enough. And they both knew it, and the knowing was enough for 40 years.